Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Some positive vibes on this Thursday morning. Indiana won its last game Tuesday night against Iowa at Assembly Hall, 74-68. A big win for the Hoosiers to snap a 3-game losing streak. I was actually looking back in the archives of the show. This is the first episode that we've done after a win since Indiana was 3-0. It's hard to believe. There was obviously those non-conference games that were late in later December that were tough. Kansas and Auburn kind of took a little bit of break for the holidays, and then not a great month of January for the Hoosiers. So a lot of episodes after losses, but here to bring some positivity on this Thursday morning. Ryan Corazza of Inside the Hall is back on Podcast on the Brink. How you doing this morning, Ryan?
I'm good. You know, I'm always bringing the positivity for the most part.
So, yeah, I mean, the game the other night, I think it's, it was a lot to get into. I know we're going to talk about some things about, schematic changes and different things that Indiana's maybe been doing these last couple games that they weren't maybe doing earlier in the Big Ten season and before that. But specific to the Iowa game, I think one of just kind of the big picture things that I took away from it was, and this kind of has been a theme under Mike Woodson, maybe not as much last season because they did finish tied for second in the Big Ten and had, for the most part, a really good season. But that first year, thinking back to it, there were some times where it seemed like Indiana things could have gone the other way. But under Woodson, it feels like even when they go on one of these losing streaks, they're able to kind of find their footing and get some positive momentum back. This team really never quit. And I think that's kind of one really positive thing that I've seen under Woodson so far, is that even kind of when times get tough, that they're able to kind of steady the ship. And we saw that happen in a big way on Tuesday night against Iowa.
For sure. You think back to last year, they had that slide in January and were able to right things, the Penn State game and a couple other ones there. And yeah, it's interesting because you can look at it in terms of it's a long season, but it's not a long season, especially, compared to the NBA. It's less than half as short of an NBA season. But, and I even look at the offseason so far, too. And I know it's not the biggest sample size, but, there hasn't been this sort of mass exodus of all these players transferring. And there is something about the culture that Mike Woodson has created where I think, maybe scheme and philosophy wise has been criticized for sure. But in terms of getting guys to buy in and really kind of being part of the culture has been definitely a bright spot for the program. And I think has been a feather in his cap so far.
Yeah, one of the guys that I was really impressed with on Tuesday against Iowa was Khalil Ware, because he's coming off a situation where he didn't play 2 straight games, battling an ankle injury, and Mike Woodson even said on the pregame radio show with Don Fisher that he wasn't sure how many minutes he was going to be able to give Ware. Obviously, things changed pretty quickly into that game with Malik Renew going down with the injury. I'm sure they didn't go in planning to play Khalil Ware 35 minutes, I think is what it was, and really down the stretch of that game, if you watched him closely, wasn't moving anywhere near 100%, was wincing at times, just kind of trying to, I think, navigate some pain more than maybe some of the on-court things that have impressed me this season with Ware. I think a performance like the one he had the other night can really open some eyes, on the NBA side of things. When a guy has been questioned, had his toughness questioned coming from Oregon, does he really want to play? How much is he really into it? And the other night, I thought he really kind of brought it as best he could and showed some things that maybe we haven't seen before.
100%. And, we've been sort of through the energy and effort stuff with him. And Woodson has talked about it the first couple of weeks. They really got on him and they saw a change from there. And that was pretty much it. And, I've spoken on this podcast before about just his demeanor. He's not a super emotional kid. He's not very demonstrative. And I think that sometimes can lend to people thinking that he's not working hard when he is. And yeah, I think right now, Kevin O'Connor, the Ringer, his latest mock draft had him maybe in the mid-20s, 26 or something like that, right? And I think he had a pretty good write-up in terms of his breakdown on what he's best at now and what he still needs to work on, all that. I do think it was interesting kind of diving in specifically to him in the Iowa game that with Renew going down so early, it was a chance for Indiana actually to sort of realize the early Mike Woodson, press conference, this sort of 4-out 1-in style he talked about. And I think where presented an opportunity with, four guards, wing, Mbako obviously played the four at times in that game, a lot of the game. Walker mixed in there as well. And Sparks had just a little bit of time in the first half. And it really felt different. It was not perfect. It was certainly flawed in some ways. It was not the greatest offensive performance of the season or of all time for Indiana, but just the space that was on the floor for multiple guys to drive it. I think because he's not a back to the basket player. He's not. Because of that, I just think the giantness of him compared to Iowa, and because he was drawing so much attention, and if you keep the ball high and passed out of it, it was really tough to guard at times, I think, for Iowa, because they just did not have the size, they didn't have the athleticism to be able to deal with him. And because he had so much gravity throughout the game, and there was more spacing on offense, everything just felt more free, more fluid, in a way that when Malik Renew gets the attention on the right low block and he's trying to whip a pass to the opposite corner, I mean, the degree of difficulty on that versus Kel'el Ware getting, double team, maybe another foot in the lane on somebody else, and he's in the middle of the paint and he's got the ball high and he can see three different guys on the perimeter and can make a decision from there. I just think that is just easier, more free, more modern, more what other teams are doing. Whether that was, again, out of necessity because Renew was gone and that's what they had to go to, or we'll see some more of that, sort of remains to be seen. But that was probably the most interesting thing to come out of the game, is just to see a little bit of a different look on offense. And that led to more three-pointers as well, I do feel like, too, which, look, they got up, I think 20, they were 8 of 22, somewhere around there. And, when you only take 9 in a game, you can go for 9, but when you take over 20, eventually it can sometimes work out in your favor. Right? I know they started hot and kind of cooled off, but you still shot 36 point something % for the game, and over a season, I think that's about what they shot last year, and they were in the top. I think they finished 37th or something 3-point. So, sometimes you can go a streak, 5-6 don't drop, but if you just keep shooting them, eventually, sometimes that can play out still for a good percentage over the total of 40 minutes of a game.
Yeah, I think one thing worth pointing out on the 3-point shooting, specific to that Illinois game where they only took 9, a lot of what Illinois tries to do defensively is to take away the three. So I think not only did Indiana, I know they got some clean looks in that game, but I think the attempts were just lower, because I think that's one thing Illinois, not obviously with Indiana, I think maybe some teams do want to let them shoot and have those looks rather than having the ball inside. But specific to the Illini, they try to take that away. One other thing specific, I guess, a couple other things specific to the Iowa game before we kind of talk a little bit more, I think, on some big picture and schematic things with Indiana, Mike Woodson, and in general. Anthony Leal, obviously a big factor coming off the bench. We saw him earlier this season. There was a stretch of games where he got a little run, and then it was like he disappeared again, didn't play anymore. I didn't quite understand why he was not playing again. I thought he showed himself to be a solid contributor there earlier. I think it was in the Big Ten season, and then like I said, he kind of disappears and doesn't play. I think he had a stretch of 3 games: Minnesota, Purdue, Wisconsin, where he didn't play at all. I know the Nebraska game and Kennesaw State earlier in the season where he got that extended run, and I thought did some good things. I thought he obviously was huge coming off the bench, making 3 3-pointers, scoring 13 points, grabbing 7 rebounds. And then the other thing I thought was huge was just the offensive rebounding. I know a lot of that was Khalil, where I think he grabbed 5 offensive boards, but it's one thing I kind of just scratched my head about really the whole season with Indiana is you have this team with all this size and you're going 6'8", 6'9", 7 foot across the front line. Why are they not better as an offensive rebounding team? And I think that's something that really they need to try to be better at because of their challenges offensively. If they can pick up some second chance points here and there in all these close games, I think that has a chance to really help them down the stretch of the season.
Yeah, on the Leal point, great story. It just is. I think it was a really cool moment. I think the fan base really responded both in the stadium and also online and just in general, anyone watching. It was just really cool to see. I will say, to your point about him, playing a little bit earlier when they needed him and then kind of dropping out of the rotation, I think the way that it's going now with Woodson and him, he's spoken to this previously that, he's done everything we've asked from him in practice. He said after the Iowa game, right, that, he's never complained a day. He shows up, he does, he doesn't complain and he keeps, doing what we ask him, doing what we ask him. And I think with Gunn and I guess you loop Banks in there, although Banks is just really falling out of the rotation these days. But there is this, I guess, because of their size and because, they're coming into their sophomore seasons now, that they take this leap. They're going to have more upside. They're going to have more potential. They're going to be better for the system than Anthony Leal is, who I know what I got with him. And that sort of seems to have been what Woodson's philosophy has been between that sort of bench wing. I mean, I wouldn't call Leal a guard, a wing, but kind of two or three player there. And I think the reality is Leal contributes to winning more. And honestly, when you watch these games, you watch the Iowa game, any game that he's come into, he's the only guy that is vocal, pointing out stuff on both ends of the floor all game. He seems to me to be, in terms of like we've talked about Malik Renew being more vocal this year. He ain't pointing out all the stuff Leal is pointing out. And so I think from that, you can quibble like, oh, well, does that really matter? Like, if you blah, blah, blah. But like, I think that's important. And you can really see it when he's out there. And secondarily, again, for a team that has had, some, maybe we call it confidence issues shooting the ball, small sample size, but he's 7-9 from 3 this year and looked super confident. I remember, I think it was the Nebraska game. He hit that left corner 3 and got fouled. Like his shot has looked pure all season long. And so, yes, at times, defensively, he's gonna try. He's gonna be in the right spots, but he's gonna, Perkins got him a few times. The other times he's been in the game, like I think he probably played in that Auburn game too. I want to say I might be wrong about that, but there are some times when he's gonna give up some scores. That said, I think the calculus now is yes, the quote unquote floor might be lower for Anthony Leal, but ultimately, if you're trying to win games and you're looking for something off the bench that's gonna be reliable in terms of trying to contribute more consistently and on both ends of the floor to winning, and you can trust a little bit more, I think Anthony Leal is pretty much proven that he can provide what is necessary out of that role, and that was not maybe development that we saw coming, but it's after this Iowa game, it's getting a little bit hard. I'm not saying he's going to be scoring double digits the rest of the season here, but there is something that he offers that I think contributes to winning in a way that is important for this team going forward.
So some bigger picture stuff now. Obviously, we've seen some changes. I know you messaged me yesterday about some things that you've been noticing on film, kind of watching these games. I'm not sure how much of it has to do with the fact that, Indiana played 2 games, Wisconsin and Illinois, with really only one big because Ware was out. And then they come back to start the Iowa game with both of them in the lineup, and then Renew goes out after 2.5 minutes. So no real choice other than to kind of switch things up with the scheme and how they want to play. What particularly are you noticing maybe these last couple of games that wasn't happening, maybe not just earlier in the season, but even going back to previous seasons under Mike Woodson?
Well, I would say, and big shout out to Coach Tony Adranya, dropped a video on this yesterday. Defensively, that nail help, right? That has been Mike Woodson's staple since the late aughts, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago in the NBA, right? It seems to have been worked out of the system. I think that was a thing that was frustrating for people to watch because the Hoosier guarding the ball handler, high ball screen goes over the screen. So the weak side, or I guess strong side help to the nail, the help defender. And then there's that wide open three on the wing over and over and over again. And now they've changed that to where they're going under the screen so that the driver is stopped with the initial defender. And that's not allowing those easy, that one pass away help is no longer there. Now, if you got a guy that can play decently stepping back and hitting the three, the initial ball handler, there are trade-offs to all types of ways that you can guard a ball screen. But I think the easy just step right into an open shot is gone. And the thing with 3-point defense too, right, is there's that luck factor. I know Ken Palm wrote about this a while, like years ago now, but I do think I wish I had pulled this up in Big Ten play. I want to say that Indiana is the best, is defending the 3-point line the best.
Yes, they're first. They're first. They're
first.
28.8% allowed on threes.
There you go. And it's the type of thing that if you had told me in December that Indiana would be defending the 3-point line better than any other team in the Big Ten, I would not have believed that. Because of how much in the non-conference and in previous seasons under Mike Woodson, there's been such that wide disparity because of how they defended it, and then B, how the low volume that Indiana takes. So look, that's a change. That's something giving credit to the staff that, we're not there. We don't really know the whys and the how on that, but it is kind of going back to that macro Mike Woodson where, last season after the Wisconsin game when they won at home, which I think was after that couple of game slide in January, being asked about nail slot rim, and he says, that's what we do. We won't get away from it. And he so often says too in these pressers that it works. It works. These guys just got to do this. Guys just got to do it. Well, Anthony, and I've said this before and have mentioned this, but Anthony Walker to me is pretty much the only guy on this team that has the athleticism and length to help at the nail and then bounce back out and be able to get a good contest up. And so, Gabe Cups ain't going to be able to do that. Galway ain't going to be able to do that. Like pretty much the whole, maybe a CJ Gunn if he really got coached up into it, right? But to me, the personnel was not there for it, but it's just in Mike Woodson's DNA, and this is what I ran when I was a head coach. Therefore, I'm going to imprint this on at a lower level where the athletes aren't as good, and I don't have a team that really has like the length to do it, and it's tough to run, and there are just more threes being shot now. Is another, again, maybe in the past, when he was a head coach, there were less threes being shot, so it's not as much of an issue there as well. So I don't know. Those are kind of just like the overall thoughts on the 3-point shooting. I think it's great that they changed, but I also wonder why it was ever run in the first place, other than this is just what he did. Therefore, I'm just going to do this. And it's kind of that tension we have sometimes we've talked about between shaping a team and a scheme with the personnel you have versus this is my system. This is what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those things where you kind of scratch your head and you look back to like the same thing was happening over and over in the early part of the season. And some of these games too that Indiana was needed to win by more points that would have really helped their metrics. A lot of those results were kind of fueled by this obvious scheme that we noticed wasn't working. There were teams that were coming into Assembly Hall that were making all these threes, and a lot of them were wide open. And it kind of makes you wonder, if this adjustment would have been made earlier, how does it change the overall trajectory of the season? Not to say that Mike Woodson doesn't deserve credit for kind of seeing at this point that something needed to be done differently and adapting to it, but I agree with what you said. Is like, why was it ever done in the first place? I think is a legitimate question, and I'm definitely interested to see kind of, if this continues. And I think you make a great point too in terms of just the personnel needed. I don't think it's just that Anthony Walker is the only guy on this roster. I just think in general, it's not something that you see a lot of other teams do for a reason, because the three ball is so valuable now in the game. And if you're set up in a way that's going to basically give the opposition a chance to step into a wide open three, that's like one of the best shots you can get on the court. And it just, I don't think it's just specific like to this personnel. I think going forward, it's not something that kind of needs to be a part of the fabric of what Indiana wants to do defensively.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Everything you said there. And look, there is the caveat, right, that just because every team is doing something a different way, it does not mean that you have to do that. It does not mean that something different can be successful. Like I look at a team like Houston, right, who right now is the number one team in the country on KenPom, has the number one defense on KenPom. And the way that they guard ball streams, they're like hyper aggressive, and they kind of do it in a way that not many other teams do, but that works, right? And that has proven to work, and they've been a great defensive team for years on end. And
because they have the players to do it, and they recruit to that.
Exactly. So, I guess I just wanted that you can zag, right? And you can do something different than what everyone else is doing. But if it's garnering results that are not good, and kind of to go to your point here about, maybe this doesn't change the trajectory of the season, but there is sort of sometimes I think also within Woodson's philosophy and how things have been run, there's like a lack of urgency in the beginning of the season. And again, this isn't 82 games plus playoffs. It's unfortunately or fortunately the way that college basketball works, and, taking the net rating into consideration and some of these things, the games early in the season against these teams that are not at your level, they matter in terms of how you perform in them. So when you have this nail help and all these lower level teams are raining threes on you, and then secondarily, you're running out the hockey subs to try to see what you got, and can these guys play together, or trying to get guys. Okay, a lot of those lineups did not do well, and leads were lost, and all of a sudden, what could have maybe been an easy double-digit win turns into, oh, we got to kind of have our stars in down the stretch. We won by 7, we won by 8, and that negatively impacts how you look towards the committee. And, who knows? They win some more of those games more convincingly. They get a Kansas, they end up winning that game. They're at least like more in the on the bubble discussion. Maybe they're at the very low level of a Eamon Brennan bubble watch. They're the last team mentioned in all the work to do. And they're probably not in the high 80s in KenPom. They might be down more in the 50s, 60s, right? So that's just sort of another thing with the philosophy and sort of what you see where I can understand from I want to see what my team has. This is the defense I've been running. Like, here's what we're doing in these games. But ultimately, when everything gets compiled over the profile of your season, doing those things ended up, putting them in a position where they're not even, sniffing the bubble right now.
Yeah. And I think when you talk about the importance of the non-conference, Indiana kind of falls in the same boat as some of these other Big Ten teams that are either completely off the bubble or trying to fight to stay on the bubble. And I think one of the reasons the league is viewed as negatively nationally as it has been is the Big Ten just wasn't good in the non-conference this season, and that really kind of sets you up for what's going to happen in league play. And the Big Ten didn't get it done in non-conference, and so now looking at a situation where I think Andy's last bracketology projection had 6 Big Ten teams, be the lowest in quite a while. And I agree with you there. You I understand like the comments of like this is a new team to me and we're trying to figure things out. And there can be some of that, but at the same time, there's not, as you mentioned, this long runway to figure it out. Like you can't be figuring things out in late January. Things need to be maybe tweaked the first couple weeks of the season, and then you need to settle on what is going to work for this team or make an adjustment and then kind of build from there. Waiting, more than I think is what more than half of the games that already been played to kind of make some of these adjustments. I think ultimately, I'm not saying that Indiana would have been a tournament team if this would have happened earlier. There's a lot, there's injuries, there's other things that have not gone particularly well, but just in general, I think waiting to kind of make the adjustment was kind of a negative overall on Indiana's season. I want to ask you too, just about we talked about the defense offensively. I agree with kind of what you talked about earlier, mentioning that kind of the 4 out, 1 in. It was just a lot more fun to watch Indiana play offensively the other night with kind of the lineups that they had on the court. Maybe part of it was that they did make some threes and they did take more threes than usual, but it kind of a light bulb kind of came on in my head, like what would it look like going forward this season, if you're playing one big and kind of trying to space the floor a little bit, what would it look like in future seasons if you could get, still have a really good big man, but all of a sudden, you've got a Liam McNeely, or you go in the portal and you get a couple guys that can shoot threes, maybe a guy that can create at the point guard position and distribute the ball. I think all of a sudden, you have a much better chance to set yourself up for success offensively. And I, quite honestly, I think the other night, even the Illinois game too, when they only had, and I know they didn't make any threes, but I thought those were two of the more, from an offensive perspective, more enjoyable games of the season to watch so far.
Agreed. And it's tricky because this is sort of where we get into the personnel discussion a little bit more, right? I think that with the season that Xavier Johnson has had, where he dealt with an injury for a while. There have been some on-court moments for him in terms of the tacticals, the ejection, and Cups isn't quite ready to do much in the ball screen work, and so you're sort of left sometimes. Now, Xavier Johnson, I think against Illinois, I did the film touch on. He had a lot of drives to the basket. All his points came off of drives to the hoop, but you're sort of left with Trey Galloway as the guy that is. I mean, they went to it. It was interesting even before Johnson got hurt. I mean, time and again down the stretch of that game, it was that side ball screen for Galloway, and I think that again, it's like he does the best he can with that. Should he, on a great team, is he more of a 6th, 7th man? And he's a little bit miscast with having to do this so much. So it's kind of a little bit of the chicken and the egg still with, do they have the personnel for it? But at the same time, when there's just more breathing room, all of a sudden guys look like they can do it more, if that makes sense, right? Like I think Mbako is working into it, and certainly the advantage for him is because he is a good 3-point shooter. He's 2 of 8 against Iowa, and obviously his percentage, but as in Big Ten season, I know he's shooting it pretty well. So he has that advantage of he can get guys closing out hard and driving. And if there's room for him to do that, then that makes sense. So yeah, it's interesting because, with Renew, I think there's a balance between he's a great post scorer and finisher. So they shouldn't just abandon that, but the over-reliant, like, I don't think Malik Renew should be having to take on 3 guys and them seemingly being okay with that as like one of their biggest moves on offense is giving Malik Reneau the ball and him just like fighting through three guys down low. And then the weird thing with that too is that, it was in the Illinois game, did not really happen on Iowa, but even on those Xavier Johnson drives and some of the drives in the Illinois game, you see an Anthony Walker, you see guys that are like on the block still when Xavier Johnson is trying to drive to the basket, right? And that buddy ball system, right, which has been, I feel like, negated more as the season has gone along, and they're playing some better talent. Where is there? He's like in the lane, and there's just so much congestion down there that, again, I mean, this is kind of a broken record on stuff. It just makes everything a little bit more difficult, a little bit more harder. This is all to say that, like, mix and match the profile a bit more. I think last year they were able to do it more effectively because they had Jalen Hood-Schifino, and there was a lot of, he had that mid-range game going. He was really good out of reads in the ball screen. And this year it's like a by committee. We're trying to get Trey Galloway better at this, and he's kind of doing that zoom handoff stuff at the elbow, etc. So I don't know. I'm kind of trying to wrap this point up here, but yes, they're really not that. I mean, they're not that far away because it was proven to work in a game they gutted out against Iowa. And I think if you can recruit to it a tiny bit more and just play the efficiencies, less long twos, more threes, it's not some foreign land, some hidden mystery, some, code they got to crack. It's kind of all right there. And we'll see as time goes if things adjust that way like they did for the defense.
And I know it's not a high volume, but looking at just kind of what Khalil Ware and Malik Reneau have done from 3-point range this season, Ware's 11 for 25, 44%, Reneau's 13, 32, 40.6%. So even if you want to play both guys together, which I think is fine, kind of speaking to your point, like get one of them out on the perimeter and get one of those defenders out of the paint rather than trying to clog things up as much. I think is just kind of one simple thing you can do moving forward. Obviously, a lot depends on the health of Reneau moving forward, Xavier Johnson, but it does kind of feel like things maybe are coming together a little bit more in terms of a more modern style of play, really on both ends of the court, which I think is good growth to see. I think you have to acknowledge that even if it didn't come maybe ideally in the right part of the season where it could have maybe been more impactful for a longer stretch of time, it is good to see now and hopefully something that continues into the future. Kind of looking ahead now, Indiana obviously has a home game coming up against Penn State on Saturday, the Nittany Lions. Haven't really dug into them too much, but they did beat Rutgers last night on the road without their best player by 15. Rutgers kind of seems like they've really gone the other way. That was kind of one of those games you look back for Indiana. I know you mentioned that Kansas game, but I think that game in the Rutgers game, if those were different outcomes, I think the outlook on Indiana's season as a whole is totally different. Instead of sitting here at something like 13-8, they're 15-6. I think people are feeling completely different about where this team is. But obviously, hindsight is 2020. But what are you looking? Not specific to Penn State, but just kind of as we move along here with a stretch really of this Penn State game, and then you go to Ohio State, who's really scuffling too. On Tuesday, feels like two opportunities for Indiana to kind of continue this momentum before they go on the road to Purdue, which is obviously going to be a tall task. What are you kind of looking for here these next couple of games to kind of get a feel on where the direction of the season and where Indiana's at?
Yeah, well, I'll put a pin in that for a second. Talking about Rutgers, I did see last night, that home loss they lost by 17 here. They scored 46 points in that game. And so I did, go with their profile here. They're 300th in the country now in offense, which for a Big Ten team, I mean, I'd have to look and I could just be, I don't know, recency bias or what have you here. But that seems almost like historically low to be that low of an offense.
Did you look at their 3-point shooting? It's like, when you open the KenPom page, you look at like 3-point three of the first things I look at are 3-point shooting, 2-point shooting, free throw shooting. 345th in threes, 350th in twos, and 341st in free throws. Like Dylan Harper can't get there soon enough for Steve Peichel.
I know. Well, that's I mean, going off a little bit off of IU now, but that's what's interesting, right? Is that through all of this, they are still 7th on defense in the country, and so they have like 2 of the best players in the country coming in next year. And if Peichel has been able to keep this defensive system intact, but he's got help on the way in offense, they could be much better next year. So it is offensively they're just hot garbage, but they're still a top 10 defensive team, which it's crazy to think because sometimes if your offense is that bad, you're going to suffer on the other side of the ball and you're not going to be trying as hard and you're going to be a little bit despondent, but they are still elite defensively. So really, really weird profile for them this year. In terms of IU, like looking forward, I think it's twofold. One is in both of these last 2 games, I think it was 2 good defensive performances. I mean, look, those are 2 elite defensive teams, or excuse me, offensive teams they played. Illinois, I know Illinois with Shannon Jr. coming back and maybe sort of mentally he's still kind of trying to figure things out, and he really was not much of a factor in that game. And I wonder if they overlooked Indiana a little bit to start in that game and they weren't really as locked in but still really good offensive team. Same thing with Iowa, that they held on as well. Obviously it helps that they were at home. But yeah, there just seems to be more strung together possessions. I know they had lulls here and there, but more strung together possessions of we know what we're doing. We're taking this away. We're having them go later in the shot clock. And so I think that continuing at that level puts them in position to win games more for sure. And then secondarily, just more variety, I think, on offense. In terms of everything. And I'm wondering if Renew is out again by necessity, if again we see more of this 4-out 1-in style, which could be a blessing in disguise in terms of playing in a style that might be more efficient and therefore give them a better chance to win. So yeah, but these injuries certainly do loom large. I think if Renew and Johnson are both out for an extended time, it definitely kind of ties one hand behind their back a little bit, but whereas he's a rare talent and they might find ways to keep working around him and spacing around him and find ways to get it done.
We'll have everything covered for you, of course, as always on Inside the Hall. We're also having a lot of women's basketball coverage lately. The women now, after that disappointing loss against Iowa, a couple weeks ago, have won 4 in a row. They're 18-2. They just won at Maryland last night for the first time in program history. That's a really great win for Terry Morin and her program. They have a big game coming up this weekend too at Ohio State on Sunday. So not just the men's game on Saturday hosting Penn State, but the women will be at Ohio State in a huge matchup in terms of determining the regular season champion in the Big Ten on the women's side. Thanks, Ryan, as always, for coming on to Podcast on the Brink. We'll look forward, obviously, to your work with the Minute After and Film Session. And as for Podcast on the Brink, as I said in the show, good to be back on a more positive note, talk about a win, talk about some positive momentum. And as always, if you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.